now, just to start our conversation, we're going to have two respondents, so we can come here. And these are going to be very short responses, like 10 minutes each, and then we can start the conversation. And then we
Hi, I'm Ben Johnson. I'm a graduate student in the department, and I'm going to moderate our brief discussion about the presentations we heard today. First, as Alberto mentioned, we'll hear responses from Ibai Atucha and Pablo La Parra Perez, and then we'll open the discussion to questions from the audience. But before we go on, if there's anyone here who doesn't understand Spanish, we're sorry that we couldn't provide simultaneous translation for Professor Palacios' talk. However, for the questions, if anyone would like me to translate Professor Palacios' comments in Spanish, I would be glad to do that. So is there anyone here who would like translation from Spanish to English for Professor Palacios' comments? No? Okay, great. So we'll move on to the responses. Ibai Atucha holds a Bachelor of Arts in Basque Philology and 2 Masters in Comparative Literature and Contemporary Philosophy, respectively. His research interests include counter-discourses and nationalism and nation formation, minorized language literatures and oppression, continental philosophy, post-colonial studies, queer theory and cultural studies, and the rest. He's the author of 2 books on Basque literary and cultural studies. The first is called On the Nation Under Erasure, published in 2010, and the second is On the Nation Over the Canon, published in 2012. Our second respondent, Pablo La Parra Perez, started the PhD program at NYU in 2012. He holds a Bachelor of Arts in Art History and a Master's degree in Comparative Studies of Literature, Art, and Philosophy. And his master's thesis analyzed the project Megaphone.net by contemporary Catalan artist Antonia Abad from the perspective of Jacques Rancier's aesthetic and political ideas. Before joining NYU, he collaborated with the Department of Archives and Conferences at the Center for Contemporary Culture of Barcelona. And his research interests include visual culture, art theory, aesthetics, radical political theory, and contemporary Spanish cultural studies.
Well, thank you first of all to Alberto for giving us the chance to be the respondents here, and thank you to Justin, Tatiana, and Manuel for these great interventions. Pablo and I have been plotting these last couple of days, thinking together about or trying to have some kind of intelligent ideas about this, and this is why also we try to create some responses that supplement each other somehow. And that's why also I will be referring more specifically to Justin's talk and also Manuel's. And Pablo will be talking about Manuel's again and Tatiana's. So, I'm going to read that. This response claims to formulate 2 questions related to Manuel and Justin's presentations by trying to approach their topics from a different geopolitical perspective. In both cases, these queries derive from a shift of the perspective with which the inside-outside relation of the late Franco transition and contemporary Spanish geopolitical space have been approached. In other words, if Manuel have understood the use given to the television for state politics and political party objectives, related on the one hand to an articulation of a new symbolic capital for democratic Spain, and on the other for particular political activities and its communication, I was wondering if taking into account Spanish situation and position in Europe after 1955 complicates somehow Manuel's proposal. Briefly, if the gaze from the outside conditions the very core and fundamental formulation of the new and democratic Spanish state. Regarding Justin's lecture, I would like to expand and shake a bit the very inside of the Spanish community interpolated by, in this case, the television. That is, I would like to ask to consider further the figures constructed on the other side of the mirror of these heroes of the nation, the caídos and the victims of terrorism. I am wondering if the construction of heroes, and more specifically this kind of national heroes, necessarily imply certain logics of construction of the criminal that oppose them, multiplying the need to articulate some activities that inhabit this inside-outside of the state. So now I'm going to develop very shortly these two questions. Returning then to Manuel's lecture, I wonder if it is possible to elaborate further your ideas about transition, post-transition, and the symbolic articulation of democratic Spain, taking into account that Franco's Spain was, since 1955 and its technocratic transformation, already active part of a democratic Europe. It was part of the UNESCO, or the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. It signed the Concordat with the Vatican. It took part in Eurovision since 1961. It won Eurovision in 1968. It won the Emmy with La Cadena. So there is all this, as you mentioned, symbolic discourses traveling around Europe that maybe can make us think again all this step-by-step history. So I was wondering if this makes us revise some of the presuppositions that implicitly sustain the studies working with Spanish TV and affect the way we could approach it. I was wondering about the multiplicity and multiplication of representations that already since late Franco dictatorship thought of and made Spain part of the economic, political, and symbolic machinery of Europe. Do you think, for example, that the tacit and not so tacit international acceptance by European democracies of Franco's dictatorship changes in some measure our way of understanding that symbolic capital with which the television had to furnish the new political regime, leading to an idea of the transition as transaction of political elite? So I was wondering if this step-by-step political transition, maybe from this European perspective, can be changed to this transición como transacción de poderes, de élites políticas. Or that the chronology of phases of significantly different geopolitical formulation is still necessary to understand transitional Spain. In short, from this international perspective, I was wondering how deep or how superficial ended up being the symbolic reformulation of the democratic Spain. And now I will refer to your presentation. You have talked about the celestial political action carried away by the so-called national heroes, enabled by their glorification and enshrinement involving artistic, symbolic, and ritualistic practices where television becomes more important than ever. I was precisely thinking about these practices and economies of subjection, and considering that any of the figures that have been analyzed, such as the caídos and the victims of terrorism, presuppose, in a somehow dialectical way, the main national foes and criminals of every specific geopolitical formation. I was wondering if you consider the shifts and the progressions of the models of the diverse formations, dictatorship and democracy, and the inhabitant of this other side of the mirror. If these affective ties that you mentioned, the alarm, the emotion, the intimacy, or powerful deaths, are also working in the representation, for example, of the rojos, of the comunistas, separatistas, or the Judeo-Masonic quotes that Franco talked all the time about, or also the imaginary of the terrorists by depictions that, as you mentioned, empties them from any political discourse. So I'm trying to go to the other side of the mirror that would think this heroes. And directly related to this, I was wondering if we could be currently going through another moment of shift on the mode of enshrinement, as a definite ceasefire of ETA has started already to displace the figure of the terrorist with the figure of the anti-system. Now the figure of the terrorist is not so predominant, and we have anti-system all over the territory. Involving under its umbrella the whole population of the state and not just part of it. To finish, in order to connect both Justin's and Palacios' interventions related to the ideas of rapture and progression that Pablo will elaborate further right now, I was wondering if precisely this concatenation of heroes and criminals, their figuration and political actions might be understood as a continuation of one political and ideological structure under different names and superficial differences, or that, on the contrary, this shift that you have made reference to shows that we are talking about two clear-cut different political formations, the dictatorship and the democratic state. That's my response, and I'll probably please.
I have to remember all that.
Do you want to answer right now? Or can I?
Well, it's better if you.
Thank you very much for your excellent presentations. Thank you also, Alberto, for inviting us to come here. I'm going to try to be really quick to allow the panelists to answer more questions and to open discussion. I would like to start, as Ibai already pointed out, addressing Professor Pavlovich's paper. And you defined Mercedes La Cabina as a political allegory of freedom and captivity, and also as a terrifying commentary on Spain's long dictatorship. Nevertheless, you also pointed out that the film was financed and aired by Spanish national television, a media infrastructure undoubtedly linked to the Francoist regime. And I think this paradox maybe deserves a deeper analysis. Specifically, I would like to pay attention to one of your remarks, one of the remarks you indicate in your paper. La Cabina was the result of the Spanish national television politics of the time, aiming, and I quote, to the production of high-quality works which could compete in international festivals, so bringing home cultural prestige and winning recognition abroad. And I found this double-sided cultural politics of late Francoism intriguing. And I mean double-sided in the sense that, on the one hand, it tolerated and even financed audiovisual productions with a certain degree of social critique, but on the other hand, was perfectly aware of the political profitability of those products for the survival of the region. At this moment, as has been said several times, Francoism was struggling to surpass the autarkic isolation of the 40s and 50s and seeking recognition and integration in the international community. And it seems that the international prestige and recognition of the Spanish cultural products, and maybe especially the audiovisual ones, was perceived by Francoist authorities as a strategic element for this, let's say, foreign whitewash. Okay? So my first question would be, was this kind of tolerated criticism really able to, as you say, challenge and discredit the official discourses of Francoism, or was it part of a more superficial liberalization that instead helped to legitimize and normalize the dictatorship through international cultural recognition? On this note, for example, I'm thinking of the normalized politics of public subsidies given by the Francoist state for highbrow and moderately critical cinema beginning in the 60s. It is probably not by chance that you tied La Cabina with Carlos Saura's El Jardín de las Delicias. As happened with most of Saura's films produced by Querejeta, most of them containing a symbolic critique of the regime, this film was also a recipient of public subsidies. As you also say, both Saura and Mercero shared, and I quote, an enigmatic and allegorical visual style that helped them to bypass censorship, and significantly, both of them were also internationally recognized authors. Nevertheless, it's also true that other explicit critiques were forbidden and censored at the time. You quote, for example, in the case of the TV, the existence of a kind of blacklist banning authors as Marcillac or Darmignac. This is part, of course, of a larger cultural debate inside the anti-Francoist opposition, dividing those who are advocating for an allegorical critical vocabulary able to outsmart censorship and reach massive audiences, and those who consider it necessary to formulate an explicit and radical critique of the dictatorship, even if these men working clandestinely. So, my second and final question for you would be, how did this debate influence the case of the television, a media that, obviously being a state monopoly, did not provide an option for the most radical underground position I mentioned before? And also, how did the anti-Francoist opposition react to method of work in that case? Then, regarding to Manuel's presentation, you started your presentation identifying two contemporary basic interpretative positions of the transition. On the one hand, a celebratory reading, considering Francoism surpassed and democratization achieved, and on the other hand, a critical reading, considering Spanish democracy as a euphemistic continuation of dictatorship. You aim to situate yourself in a complementary perspective between those positions, and I think this is probably an apt point of view. The notions of rupture and continuity between Francoism and democratic Spain are probably not a matter of black and white polarized readings, but rather ambiguously overlapping categories. Let me pick up some examples from your text that I think deserve further discussion in that sense. You mentioned, for example, the continuity of a great degree of state control over public television that prevailed without interruption during the dictatorship, the transition, and democracy. As you also pointed out, it has been traditionally assumed in Spain that the party that wins elections has the right to use TV for its own partisan interests. In relation to this, I would like you to say something about the attempt to reform public TV by the Zapatero government in 2006, a reform that was presented by the government as the first serious attempt to break this logic of state control over public media, and then was quickly overturned by the new conservative government, not surprising. And then I have another question to conclude, and I promise is the final one. Pushing forward these ideas of continuity and rupture. And one of the most complex issues during the transition was the devolution of power, political power, to semi-autonomous communities inside Spain. Even if this process was extremely limited and incomplete, it also meant a small step toward decentralization and recognition of cultural difference, making it obviously an element of discontinuity in relation to Francoism. During the 80s, one of the most urgent cultural politics of the new semi-autonomous governments was the foundation of public TV channels. In the case of regions with a strong feeling of national difference, notably the Basque Country and Catalonia, the first communities indeed to start TV channels, the creation of autonomous public TV was perceived as a way of vindicating a linguistic, cultural, and social heritage radically different from the values promoted by Francoist Spain. Nevertheless, it seems that these new projects have reproduced on a smaller administrative scale the overwhelming degree of political control over the public media, characteristic of the Spanish citizens' Francoism. I would like you to also comment on this apparent paradox of a democratizing political project that sees the recognition of national difference inside the Spanish state and its media promotion that simultaneously reproduces a pre-democratic logic, the top-down partisan control of public media.
So you can start answering this question.
Okay. I think it was time to think. Okay, so my questions were about the other side, the Rojos and Etarras, and how they relate to the enshrinement of the caídos and the victims of ETA. And then also the displacement of, if I see it, displacement of ETA victims as the premier abject subjects by protesters, the anti-sistema movement in the United States. So actually, in my other writing, I have talked about that relationship, and what I argue is that there is a relationship between what I call afterlife, or the glorification of the afterlife, and mere life, and there I've drawn Judith Butler's theory of grievability, or what constitutes a grievable life, versus Giorgio Agamben's idea of mere life as the protection and banning of the politically unintelligible living being. And so one thing Butler says is that the production of grievable lives is established over and above and depends upon the life that cannot be grievable, the production of the ungrievable life. And so from that I take it, she talks about the difference between, say, the heroes of 9/11 versus all of those lives lost in Afghanistan and Iraq that are just written off as collateral damage. They're not grievable, right? And yet there is a relationship between them. And so, yeah, I think that the production of one definitely depends on the production of the other. The intelligibility of the in this case, caídos and victims of ETA depends on the production of non-victims, the production of rojos as not precisely as non-victims, is that those who cannot aspire to victim status and therefore are not gained access to political intelligibility. And the same with etarras, right? They're necessarily constructed as non-victims, and that non-victimness is what precludes their political intelligibility. So, yeah, I think the hyper-visibility of one is dependent on the production of the non-victimness and banning of the other. And another thing I wanted to mention, though, is that there are plenty of narratives of martyrdom and victimhood on the other side, in both the case of rojos and etarras, right? Like, as we know, there were especially a number of novels and memoirs written in exile by Republicans that adopt a very similar kind of discourse of martyrdom, and Noel Vallis has written about that, interesting writing about that, where they kind of, it's in a surprising way, mirror this Catholic overtones of the discourse of the caídos in their own way. And of course, in the Basque country, the Basque separatist left and ETA members, especially those who have been tortured and imprisoned, have had their own, cast themselves as primary victims of the Spanish state. That's been a huge rallying cry. The only thing is that those claims, those narratives about their own victimhood and that of metonymically that of the Basque country, have been objectified to such an extent within mainstream political, public discourse in general in Spain that that objectification is part of their production as non-victims. Their claims to victim status become material to further delegitimize their claims to victim status. As to the displacement of the etarra as the big malo by anti-sistema people, I'm not sure I don't know, maybe I could turn the question around on you. Do you think there's a relationship? I don't see a relationship. I mean, I do think that victim discourse doesn't have the same amount of presence as it did before the financial crisis. Now it's like now the two are competing for attention, you know, and I'm not sure what the relationship would be. With the prospect of you know, the entrega de armas and all of that, at the victim enshrinement has seemed to have lost some of its traction, but it hasn't quieted down for sure. But I'm not sure if I see I don't know if there's like an eclipsing or I don't know. What do you think?
Let's start going. No, I was wondering because what is actually happening is that the anti-terrorist laws are applied to anti-system action, and I was also thinking about a couple of years ago. I was in the Basque watching TV, and I saw after some riots in Barcelona, a mother talking in television, and she was saying her son was taken by the police, applied the anti-terrorist law for burning something in the street in some riots, and applied the anti-terrorist law. And she was claiming how her son was a Modolic student, not an anti-systema. And what it came to my mind is like, well, welcome to the Basque country. Right? This kind of discourse that is like, no, but my son is not a terrorist, my son is a Modolic student. This has been the Basque country, and recently, what I was looking for in this case was also who I mean, what I was thinking about is that basically the figure of the shrine caído has been lost somehow, right? So if there's the terrorist and the victims of the terrorism, now the victims of the system seems that it's kind of diluted somewhere, right? So basically, I was thinking like if it was possible to make some, next step. That was what I was going to.
Yeah. I don't want to take up too much more time because I just gave a long rambling, but something that strikes me about the whole anti-Sistema movement is that they've adopted some similar strategies of these claims to victim status by highlighting not so much their political agenda as using the internet to proliferate all of these images of all the violence that's committed against them. Bloody faces, people that have lost lives, and all of the tragedies of police brutality. So, which